We're here with Stella Assange, the wife of Julian Assange, the Australian journalist who has been in Belmarsh maximum security prison in London for 3.5 years now, wanted by the United States for revealing war crimes and other criminal conduct during the War on Terror. Thanks for being here, Stella.
Thank you.
Now, the first question is one I guess you get asked all the time, but how is Julian?
Julian is fighting for his survival, and he's going through hell. That's the best way to put it. Sometimes it's been really very difficult for him, and sometimes when he's able to see the children, when he's with the children, when there's progress in the case, then he's energized, and he's energized by all the support that he sees out there for him. He gets letters of support and expressions of support constantly, so all these things energize him, but it's a very difficult situation because he's been there since April 2019.
And can you just give us a flavour of what the regime at Belmarsh is like for a prisoner like Julian?
Well, Belmarsh has about 800 prisoners, I think, and it's a very harsh regime because it has very serious offenders. It also has people on remand for very, non-serious offences, and it has people who are like Julian, who are there's some kind of political aspect to it. Everyone is treated as if they were a serious offender, and this is what distinguishes Belmarsh from other prisons. When Julian calls, for example, we only get 10 minutes at a time, and the explanation for that is that that's because they're surveilling the phone calls, and there's a technical limitation to how they can surveil the phone calls. So that's incredibly frustrating to have just 10-minute chunks of phone calls. Julian is in his cell for over 20 hours a day. It varies from day to day. During lockdown, it was for a critical week where there was an outbreak in his wing. It was 24/7 for several days in a row. The prisoners, it's not like you imagine prison like you see on on TV. They don't sit together when they eat. They have to queue up to collect their food, and then they have to eat in their own cell. Isolation is the norm, and sometimes they're allowed out to collect medication, to collect food, to go to the yard, which should be once a day, for an hour, but in practice it's less. Social visits and legal visits, and the visits occur a few times a week, if that. Sometimes there are visits get cancelled, like with the death of the Queen. The visits got cancelled on Sunday last week. So you're basically not in control of your environment or anything. You're not in control of the routine, you're not in control of what you eat, how you eat. Other people have control over your physical environment and over your person. Yeah.
And can you talk about the fact he's in Belmarsh maximum security prison, because he was put there directly out of the embassy when at that time his crime, in inverted commas, was violating bail. And I did a story a couple of years ago that found that there was only 2 prisoners in Belmarsh of the 800 or so that were in there for the same crime, and everyone over 33%, over a third, were there for murder or very serious assault. Why is he in Belmarsh? He's never been convicted of or charged with any violent offence.
Well, I think they keep him in Belmarsh because they can get away with it. because it's the most effective way of silencing him, precisely because of this extreme regime that Belmarsh is known for. And it's a punishment in itself. Julian, the very fact that he is in prison for having exercised his right to seek and actually obtain asylum, that's a right that's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is a long recognized right that every person has, and it violated a technicality, and it's usually treated as a technicality if there is a sufficient reason for violating the bail, and in this case there undeniably was. In fact, went into the embassy should have been a sufficient defense to not even be convicted of the violation of the Bail Act. And that violation anyway is rarely punished. Sometimes it's punished with a fine. Very rarely is it actually punished with prison time. And he finished serving that prison sentence in October 2019. But effectively it's an indefinite sentence, because while he exercises his right to challenge the US extradition request, the UK keeps him in Belmarsh at the request of the US government.
And we at Declassified have done a lot of stories about the irregularities and conflicts of interest in the case. Do you think that the UK judiciary has been captured by the state in this case?
This case is entirely political by its very nature, because of what Julian's accused of. He's a publisher accused of publishing information that the US kept secret, crimes that it had kept secret, that it had deemed classified. And that's always going to be the case with war crimes, for example, that are covered up. It's a necessary part of the cover-up is to keep it secret. So if a journalist does their job, they will publish in the public interest and reveal things that the government wants to keep secret. Julian is accused of a political offense under the Espionage Act. The US has repurposed an act that was passed in 1917 during the First World War. It was immediately used to silence and imprison dissenters from the get-go. And now it's been repurposed to silence a publisher. It's also a politically motivated prosecution, because depending on who sits in the White House, Julian gets prosecuted or he doesn't. So under Obama, there was a decision by the Department of Justice to not prosecute Julian for the Manning leaks. And this was announced by a DOJ spokesperson whose name is Matthew Miller. And he said, there is no way to prosecute WikiLeaks in the Manning case without setting a precedent for the rest of the press. And he also said, Julian Assange is not a hacker, he's a publisher, and we can't go after him for that reason. And by then, when the DOJ made this decision, that was after the Manning court-martial. So they had gone through all the evidence that there was at that stage, and they reached that conclusion. Then the Trump administration came in and they reversed that decision precisely because it was going to set a precedent to be able to go after the press. So there's just no question that this is a political case. And when you have a political case of this kind of magnitude, it really puts everything to the test. It puts the judiciary to the test, puts the press to the test, and, well, a democratic society, it's, to put it like that, its ability to defend its own interest. It puts that to the test. And in all these respects, I think Julian has shown that none of these entities, institutions, are very robust. And in fact, they've failed. I have to remain optimistic that the UK judiciary is going to correct this monumental travesty. This is the defining case for our times. Julian is the most important and significant political prisoner of our generation, of the century, precisely because he embodies the long-established principles of what it means to live in a democratic society, whether you can hold governments to account, whether you can expose corruption, whether you can expose crimes when they are committed by state officials or under state sanction. Can you do that or can you not do that? And I think it also signifies, this case also signifies where we stand in whether we've shifted from what we understood as a democratic, accountable society into actually a security state that masquerades as a democracy. And Julian is the test of where that stands.
And this is why the appeal is so important against the original decision, because the original decision by District Judge Vanessa Barreza, although it blocked the extradition, it was on very narrow grounds around his mental health and possibility of suicide. In fact, if you read that judgment, she basically agreed with every dot and comma of the US indictment, which is terrifying for anyone in Britain, but also globally, who wants to investigate US war crimes, because it effectively gives them the right to go and pluck any journalists from anywhere and bring them to the United States and stick them in a hole in the desert for the rest of their lives. So can you just give us an update on that appeal process, and when we'll be hearing about whether they'll hear the appeal and then when the appeal will go ahead?
Well, in relation to the appeal, yes, all the kind of substantive issues on press freedom, on the political nature of this prosecution, the political motivation of it, the way it is trying to silence Julian's political beliefs, and the fact that Julian is being accused of a political offense. This is a very technical aspect. It is a long-established rule of extraditions that you cannot extradite a person for political offenses. And the Espionage Act offenses are political offenses by definition. And even the US-UK Extradition Act explicitly, in Article 4, the US-UK Extradition Treaty explicitly prohibits extraditions for political offenses. So this is one of the very obvious aspects in which, for which the extradition should be blocked. And in fact, when the indictment first came down, there were all these legal commentators, I recall at the time, well, one or two, but prominent people who said, well, this can't really be a serious extradition effort because of course it will be blocked. The extradition treaty itself prohibits extradition for these offenses, so it must be just for show. Well, it's not just for show. And when you challenge these long-established principles through practice, then you're on. Then it's a slippery slope. These things that have long been established can end up being suspended and disappear forever. There's important new information about the abuse of the U.S. government, that the U.S. government has been involved in the process, and also while Julian was in the embassy, which has come to be known after the original extradition hearing in 2020. And this is also part of the appeal. The CIA's role in basically imprisoning Julian and planning for much worse has become quite clear now. There was a story that came out about a year ago now, which revealed that the CIA under Trump had been making explicit plans, not just to kidnap and poison Julian, but to rendition him and even to assassinate him while he was in the embassy. So, I mean, when you ask whether one can expect a just outcome in this extradition, I think, the judiciary depends on its perception of legitimacy. And this story about how the CIA was planning to murder Julian, I think it really puts the judiciary, the British judiciary, on the spot. Like, you can't come back from that. How can you possibly get away with saying that it's okay to extradite a person? I mean, let alone, let's forget about all the circumstances about Julian revealing war crimes and that he's a journalist, and forget all that and all the criminality that has been committed against him and his lawyers. And just, if he were any other person and there was reports, very credible reports. This story has over 30 sources. I don't think the UK courts can come back from what is now known about what has been done to Julian. So, if Julian were any other person, forget about him being a journalist, forget about him publishing evidence of war crimes by the US government. The US government has plotted to assassinate him. If the UK judiciary goes along with this extradition and orders the extradition to the country that planned his assassination, it loses all credibility.
Interestingly, it's not the assassination revelations which came out after the original decision was made was shocking, but even before that, the decision, it had been revealed that the CIA, who were behind the prosecution of Julian Assange, was spying on his privileged conversations with his defense lawyers. Now, in any normal case, that would immediately have the case thrown out, because how can you have a fair process if the prosecutors know exactly what the defense tactics are of the defendant? And in fact, in the Pentagon Papers case, where with Daniel Ellsberg, he was on trial and it got thrown out because it was revealed that the Nixon administration, or Nixon personally, had ordered his Ellsberg psychiatrist's office to be burglarized to get dirt on him to smear him in the media. That the case was thrown out. Now, to an outsider, it seems unbelievable that the case not only goes through that, but then goes through the fact that the same agency has plotted to assassinate the defendant. I can't think of anything else that can happen that would get this case thrown out. Why are we still here?
Well, it's a good question. I try to understand it myself. what's different from the Pentagon Papers case? I think what's different is a deference to the intelligence services, that even outright criminality is business as usual. I don't, you see, I think since Julian and WikiLeaks published on Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay and the cables, some of the most important cables are the ones where the US Embassy is corrupting foreign countries' judicial systems. For example, in Germany, a German citizen who was kidnapped and tortured and taken on CIA rendition flights to black sites, and so on. And then the CIA discovered this was a case of mistaken identity. The man had nothing to do with terrorism, and then they dumped him in Macedonia. Okay, Germany opened a probe, and then the US Embassy basically neutralized it and said, take it no further. And they didn't. There was never an extradition. It was known who these individuals were, who kidnapped and tortured a German citizen. Perfectly known. But there was never an extradition request for these people. They were never put on trial. There was no serious effort to hold these people to account. And that was because the US intervened. Similarly in Italy, similarly in Spain, in relation to a Spanish journalist who was killed by the US military deliberately in Baghdad, José Coso. There was a probe in Spain, and again the US Embassy intervened, used its political power to stop it, and to further US impunity. I think it's not a point of no return, though. I think this case, Julian's case, so much is known about it, and the persecution is so clear. It is so clear that Julian is a political prisoner, not just because of, what the newspapers have published eventually, because all this is now known, but because the UN Special Rapporteur has written a book about it, because there are thorough investigative pieces. Also the Italian journalist Stefano Maurizi has written a book, that there are films being made. The propaganda around WikiLeaks and Julian has no credibility anymore. And the political persecution, on the other hand, is clear. So the UK judiciary's credibility is really what is on trial. And it can redeem itself by blocking the extradition. And I have the hope that it can still do that. But obviously, so far it's failed.
And can we talk a little bit about the role of the media? Because, in my opinion, part of the reason that these flagrant violations of process and the outrageous nature of the case that you've outlined, part of it is the reason they've been allowed to get away with it, and it's still robust and it's still going through the courts, and we don't know where it's going to end now, is because the media in Britain has not covered it at all. In fact, us at Declassified, we're the only outlet that has done any investigative work around the legal case, around the judiciary, around the conflicts of interest. And even on a campaigning level, where are the newspapers that benefited from Julian's bravery and the WikiLeaks, that they do come out and say we're against the extradition, but there's no campaigns? Why?
It's a very interesting thought experiment. If the newspapers, especially the ones that collaborated with WikiLeaks, which isn't just The Guardian, it's also The Telegraph, it's Channel 4, it's BBC, The Independent. All of these were in had agreements with WikiLeaks about publishing those materials. It was a joint venture, a joint publishing venture. And if they had reported fairly and diligently and critically about this case, would Julian be in Belmarsh Prison today? I don't believe so. I don't think he would have spent a single day in prison, because in many ways, for many years, they enabled the hounding of Julian out of negligence, out of degree of, for different reasons, complicity in, because WikiLeaks challenged the old order media, the legacy media, the way things were done. And Julian's profile was also much higher than, the editor of the most well-established newspaper in the UK, for example. Most people don't know who that is. So Julian was an inconvenience and was changing the landscape. And so I think there was a lot of jealousy there. But these petty personal issues among journalists, of which it's kind of endemic to journalism, or to some of the journalist class, I'd say, has had such a pernicious effect, because Julian is the test case. And what is not properly understood, I think, because of their failure to report accurately, critically, diligently, is that Julian is being prosecuted as a journalist. They are going after him as a journalist, not as a whistleblower, not as anything else. The activities that they have criminalized are journalistic activities. And over the years, there was so much perception management by many of these actors in the press. Very surface arguments without focusing on the core of the issue, which was that Julian was politically vulnerable and was being put in a position of legal limbo year after year, that administrative excuses were being used in order to keep him arbitrarily detained for over a decade. And, for the first 9 years until he was dragged out of the embassy, he was never charged. And there was just a complete catastrophic failure to accurately report that. And I think right now, the press is in a bit of an awkward position, because the narratives that they have been furthering for so long just don't fit the reality, and the public perceives that. The public doesn't. I think there's a fatigue around how the explanation of how Julian came to be incarcerated, because it doesn't fit what people can see for themselves, which is there's a guy in prison for 3.5 years who isn't convicted of anything, and it has to do with publishing war crimes. Like, how does this fit with all this other stuff that they've been filling our heads with for so many years about Julian's character? I think there's just a complete disconnect that the public can perceive, that they've been misled.
What's your message to the British media, particularly now? Because, like you said with the judiciary, it's not too late. If they actually started looking into this case, campaigning, and actually made this a mainstream issue, things might change now. It's still possible, isn't it?
Well, I think it's not only desirable, it's not only important, couldn't be of more importance to press freedom in this country, to, you know, individual freedoms, because the press freedom is at the core of what we're able to know and therefore act on and campaign on and change at every level. But it's also more interesting from a journalistic perspective. I'll give you an example. So when Priti Patel approved the extradition, this was back in June 17th. So everyone expected Priti Patel to approve the extradition because it's Priti Patel. But a story came out of that. About 10 days after she had approved the extradition, Mike Pompeo, who was the director of the CIA while the CIA was plotting to assassinate Julian, no longer head of the CIA, nothing to do with the US administration, nothing under Biden. Obviously, he was a Trump official. He visited Priti Patel 10 days after Priti Patel approved the extradition. Priti Patel does a photo op in the Home Office with the former CIA director. How inappropriate is that? Not just any guy, but the guy who ordered the assassination plans of Julian, who she had just approved the extradition of. Okay, so a few days after that, the Wall Street Journal gets a scoop, which is that Priti Patel had, through one of her Home Office workers, requested for the DOJ to publicly praise her for approving the extradition. Now, we have like the way these things are commonly talked about, or the establishment line is that Priti Patel is just exercising a quasi-judicial function. Her hands are tied. It's all in the act, in the Extradition Act, and she has very little room for maneuver, and she just follows what it says in the act. Why on earth would she need praise from the DOJ for approving the extradition? The DOJ declined, interestingly, and there's something you can read into that. But someone did give her praise, and that was Mike Pompeo on Twitter. So that's it. That's an incredibly interesting story from a journalistic perspective. It ties in all these different aspects. And Priti Patel, you know, her ties to, you know, interests that are hostile to Julian are well documented as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a bit of work on that as well. Related to this, what do you think the end goal is for the US government? Because as you're talking, I'm just thinking it is an absolute PR disaster for the US and the British judiciary, this case, because as you say, it's revealed that these institutions that we're meant to revere and believe in are actually fragile and can be captured quite easily. It's really exposed where power lies. If he actually ends up being extradited, you've got a journalist being extradited to a country which is on record as plotting to assassinate him, on record as spying on his privileged conversation with his lawyers, and he's being sent to his death by a legal system which is apparently independent of the state. I don't believe that they want that. I think that what they've got, this is my personal take, I think they want to destroy him with the process itself. Do you agree with that, or do you think that that their end goal is to get him to the US?
I think it is a war of attrition. I think there are some people within the US government, people within the UK government, who understand how cancerous this whole affair is, how harmful it is, because it's corrupting, right? In order to keep this going, it's corrupting the system at every level. But then there are the short-term interests. And the short-term interests, for example, are, well, in the US, they're thinking, well, as long as he's in a prison in a different jurisdiction, we don't have to worry about it. For the UK, it's, well, we can blame this on the US, and we keep him silenced with this excuse that he's a flight risk if he's released. But at the same time, you know, the UK's and the US's standing, and I know it sounds, I'm cynical about these things, but still, their ability to project themselves internationally within institutions which I think can actually deliver internationally. The UN system, for example. If the US and the UK start really undermining the UN system and the international legal system in such a flagrant manner, then the whole thing falls apart. And of course, these are empires, but the difference is that basically the undermining of these systems that became institutionalized and systematic during the so-called war on terror, initially it was outwards looking, black sites in other countries and, torture regimes through carve-outs. But now they've basically internalized that into the UK system, into the US system. So now with Julian's case, they're basically, if Julian gets extradited to the US, doing away with the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is the one thing that distinguishes the US from every other superpower. It actually has a strong free speech principle that has worked. The UK has less so, but also as a principle, it is a counterbalance to the kind of raw, dark aspects of the state. And if you start weakening that and undermining that, which is what is happening both in the US and the UK, by keeping Julian imprisoned, then you are fundamentally corrupting the entire system.